Maya pulled her beat-up Honda into the parking lot of Peterson's Auto Repair, the engine making that awful grinding noise that had been getting worse all week. She turned off the car and sat there for a moment, looking at the intimidating garage through her windshield. The place looked exactly like every other auto shop she'd ever been to. Big, loud, and full of men who would probably take one look at her and assume she didn't know the difference between a wrench and a screwdriver. But she needed her car fixed, and this was the closest place to her part-time job at the grocery store. Maya took a deep breath, grabbed her purse, and headed toward the front door. The smell of motor oil and gasoline hit her as soon as she stepped inside, mixed with the metallic scent of tools and machinery. It was actually a smell she loved, even though most girls her age would probably wrinkle their noses at it. The waiting area was typical. Plastic chairs that had seen better days, outdated magazines scattered on a coffee table, and a small TV, mounted in the corner playing some daytime talk show with the volume too low to hear properly. Behind the counter, she could see into the main garage where two mechanics were working under the hood of a pickup truck, their voices echoing off the concrete walls. A man emerged from the back office, wiping his hands on a paper towel. He was probably in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of permanent grease stains under his fingernails that came from decades of working on cars. His name tag read Frank, and he had the look of someone who owned the place and had been doing this job since before Maya was born. Frank glanced up at her with the kind of expression people get when they're busy and don't want to be interrupted. He didn't say hello or ask how he could help her. Instead, he just stood there, looking annoyed like she was bothering him by existing in his shop. "We're not hiring," he said flatly, barely looking at her before turning his attention back to some paperwork on the counter. "And if you're selling candy bars or magazine subscriptions for school, I'm not interested." Maya felt her cheeks get warm with embarrassment. This wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about why she was somewhere, but it still stung every time. She cleared her throat and tried to keep her voice steady. "Actually, I'm here about my car," she said, pulling her keys out of her purse. "It's making a really loud grinding noise when I start it, and I think there might be something wrong with the alternator." Frank finally looked up from his paperwork, and Maya could see the skepticism written all over his face. He looked her up and down like he was trying to figure out if she was joking or just incredibly naive. "Your car?" he said, and there was something almost mocking in his tone. "How old are you, 16? And you think you know what's wrong with it?" "I'm 17, Maya replied, trying to keep the irritation out of her voice. "And yes, I know what's wrong with it. The grinding noise is coming from the alternator area, and my headlights have been dimming when I'm idling at red lights." Frank actually chuckled at this, shaking his head like she'd just told him the funniest joke he'd heard all day. The sound of his laughter made Maya's stomach twist with anger and humiliation. "Look, sweetheart," he said, using that condescending tone that adults sometimes used when they thought they were being patient with children. "Car problems are complicated. Why don't you have your dad come in here and talk to us about what's really going on with your vehicle? We can explain everything to him in terms he'll understand." The other mechanics had stopped working and were now listening to the conversation. One of them, a guy who looked like he was in his 30s with tattooed arms, was grinning like this was the most entertaining thing that had happened all day. The other one, older and wearing a baseball cap backwards, was trying not to laugh, but not trying very hard. Maya felt her face burning now, and she could feel her heart beating faster. She'd dealt with this kind of thing before, but it never got easier. People saw a teenage girl and automatically assumed she couldn't possibly know anything about cars or engines or mechanical things in general. It didn't matter that she'd been working on cars since she was 12 years old, or that she could diagnose problems that stumped grown men. "I don't need my dad to come with me," she said, and this time she couldn't keep the edge out of her voice. "I paid for this car myself, with money I earned from my job. I've been working on engines since I was in middle school. The alternator is putting out inconsistent voltage, which is why my electrical system is acting up." Frank's eyebrows went up at this, but not in a good way. If anything, he looked even more amused, like a teacher who'd just heard a student claim they'd invented a new type of math. "Oh, you've been working on engines, have you?" he said, crossing his fat arms over his chest. Let me guess. You changed your oil once and now you think you're a mechanic? The tattooed mechanic actually laughed out loud at this, and Maya felt something snap inside her chest. She was tired of this, tired of having to prove herself over and over again to people who refused to take her seriously, just because of how old she was and what gender she happened to be. I know more about engines than you think I do, she said, her voice getting stronger. I can tear down a small block Chevy and put it back together. I know the difference between a timing belt and a serpentine belt. I can read a wiring diagram and use a multimeter to trace electrical problems. Frank was still smiling, but now there was something almost mean in his expression. Maya could tell he was enjoying this, enjoying making her feel small and stupid in front of his employees. Is that right? He said. Well, aren't you just a little automotive genius? Tell you what, since you're such an expert on car engines, maybe you'd like to put your money where your mouth is. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't like where this was going, but she also couldn't back down now. Not with 3 grown men staring at her like she was some kind of circus. What do you mean? She asked. Frank's smile got wider, and Maya realized he was about to make her some kind of offer that would probably end up making her look foolish. But she also knew that if she walked away now, she'd never be able to come back here. And more importantly, she'd be letting these men think they were right about her. The garage got quieter as the radio in the back seemed to lower its volume, and Maya could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Whatever Frank was about to propose, she had a feeling it was going to change everything about this ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She stood up straighter, looked Frank directly in the eyes, and waited for him to make his move. Deep down, she knew her grandfather would have been proud of her for not backing down, even if he might have worried about what she was getting herself into. Frank pushed himself up from the counter and walked around to face Maya directly. He was a big man, probably 6 feet tall, and built like someone who'd been lifting heavy car parts for most of his adult life. Standing this close to him, Maya had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact, but she refused to look away or step backward. The 2 mechanics had completely stopped pretending to work now. The one with the tattoos had actually put down his wrench and was leaning against the pickup truck, watching the scene unfold like it was better than whatever was on the waiting room television. The older guy in the baseball cap had come out from under the hood and was wiping his hands on a rag, grinning from ear to ear. Here's what I'm thinking, Frank said, and Maya could tell from his tone that he thought he was about to be very clever. I've got a car out back that's been giving my best guys here some real trouble. Been sitting there for 3 whole days and we can't figure out what's wrong with it. He gestured toward his mechanics like he was introducing celebrities. Tony, over there, has been working on cars for 15 years. Rick's been doing this job since before you were born. Both of them are stumped by this particular vehicle. Maya glanced at Tony, the tattooed mechanic, who gave her a little wave that was clearly meant to be mocking. Rick just shook his head and chuckled, like Frank was setting up the punchline to a really good joke. The car starts up just fine, Frank continued, clearly enjoying himself. Engine cranks, sounds healthy, but then it just dies. Won't stay running. No matter what we do to it. We've thrown everything at this thing, new spark plugs, fuel filter, even checked the fuel pump. Nothing works. Maya felt her stomach tightening. She could see where this was heading and she didn't like it one bit. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that she was being backed into a corner, and the only way out was straight through, whatever Frank was planning. So here's my proposition for you, little Miss Mechanic, Frank said, crossing his arms again. You think you're so smart about engines? You think you know more than guys who've been doing this for decades? Fine, let's see you prove it. The garage got so quiet that Maya could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Even the radio in the back seemed to have gone silent, like the whole building was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I'll give you exactly 1 hour, Frank said, holding up one finger. 60 minutes to figure out what's wrong with that car and get it running properly. If you can do that, I'll fix your alternator problem for free. Won't charge you a penny for parts or labor. Maya's heart started beating faster. A free repair would save her almost $300, money she really couldn't afford to spend right now. Her part-time job at the grocery store didn't pay much, and she was trying to save every dollar she could for college next year. But, Frank continued, and Maya knew there had to be a catch. When you can't figure it out, and trust me, you won't be able to figure it out, you're going to pay me double my usual rate for fixing your car, and you're going to apologize for wasting our time and pretending you know something about automotive repair. Tony laughed out loud at this. Come on, Frank, he said. That's not even fair. The kid probably can't even find the oil dipstick, let alone diagnose a complex engine problem. And, Frank added, clearly warming to his theme, you don't ever come back in here acting like you know what you're talking about. You bring your car in like every other customer, you keep your mouth shut about what might be wrong with it, and you let the actual mechanics do their jobs. Maya felt heat rising in her cheeks again. But this time it wasn't just embarrassment. It was anger, pure and simple. These men were treating her like she was some kind of joke. Like the idea of a 17-year-old girl knowing anything about cars was so ridiculous it was funny. She thought about her grandfather, about all those Saturday mornings in his garage when she was younger. He'd never talked down to her or treated her like she couldn't understand things just because she was young or female. He'd explained everything patiently, let her make mistakes, and taught her that the most important thing about fixing cars wasn't how strong you were or how loud you could talk, but how carefully you could think through problems. What kind of car is it? Maya asked, and she was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. Frank's eyebrows went up like he was surprised she was actually considering his challenge. 2018 Honda Civic, practically brand new. Should be. Easy to work on if you really know what you're doing. And you said it cranks but won't stay running? That's right, starts up for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, then dies. Every single time. Maya nodded slowly. She'd seen similar problems before, and while they could be tricky to diagnose, they weren't impossible. The key was being systematic about it, checking the most likely causes first and working your way through the possibilities one by one. What about fuel delivery? She asked. Have you checked the fuel pressure? Rick snorted with laughter. Of course we checked fuel pressure. What do you think we are, amateurs? We've been doing this since you were in diapers, little girl. Maya ignored him and kept looking at Frank. Ignition system? Timing? All checked, Frank said. Like I told you, we've thrown everything at this car. It's got us completely stumped, which is why I know you're not going to be able to figure it out either. Maya took a deep breath. She knew this was probably a mistake. These guys had years more experience than she did, and they'd already spent 3 days working on this problem. The smart thing to do would be to walk away, find another garage, and pay whatever it cost to get her alternator fixed. But something about Frank's smug expression made that impossible. Something about the way Tony and Rick were looking at her like she was entertainment instead of a real person made her want to prove them wrong, even if it meant taking a huge risk. 1 hour? She asked. 1 hour, Frank confirmed. Starting from the moment you put your hands on that car. Maya looked around the garage one more time. At Frank with his arms crossed and his confident smile. At Tony and Rick, who were clearly expecting to have a good laugh at her expense. At the tools hanging on the walls and the diagnostic equipment that she'd need to use if she was going to have any chance of succeeding. Then she thought about her grandfather again, about what he'd taught her about never backing down from a challenge, especially when people underestimated you because of who you were. All right, she said finally. You've got a deal. But when I fix your car, I want more than just a free repair. I want an apology. From all 3 of you. Frank's smile got even wider. When you fix it, he repeated, like the idea was so absurd it was hilarious. Sure, kid. When you fix it, we'll all apologize. Hell, we'll throw you a parade. Tony and Rick both cracked up at this, and Maya felt her jaw clench. She'd show them. She'd show all of them exactly what Eduardo Martinez had taught his granddaughter about fixing cars. Tony, Frank called out, show our young automotive expert to her impossible project. This should be entertaining. Tony led Maya through the main garage area toward a side door that opened to the back lot. As they walked past the other cars being worked on, Maya could feel her heart pounding harder with each step. What had she gotten herself into? These guys had been working on cars longer than she'd been alive, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with this Honda. What made her think she could do any better? But then she remembered something her grandfather used to tell her whenever she got nervous about tackling a difficult repair. "Maya," he'd say in his calm, patient voice, "the car doesn't know how old you are or what you look like. It only knows if you're listening to what it's trying to tell you." The backlot was smaller than she'd expected, with maybe 6 or 7 cars parked in various states of repair. Tony walked her over to a silver Honda Civic that looked practically brand new. The paint was still shiny, the tires looked fresh, and if Maya hadn't known better, she would have assumed it had just rolled off the dealer's lot. "There she is," Tony said, patting the roof of the Honda like it was a stubborn pet. "Looks innocent enough, doesn't she? But this little beauty has been making us look like idiots for 3 days straight." Maya walked around the car slowly, taking in details. The hood was already propped open, and she could see that the engine bay was clean and well maintained. Someone had obviously taken good care of this vehicle, which made the problem even more puzzling. "What exactly happens when you try to start it?" Maya asked, pulling her phone out to check the time. She wanted to make sure she knew exactly when her hour started. "Engine cranks just fine," Tony explained, leaning against the car next to her. "Sounds healthy, like there's nothing wrong with it at all. But then it fires up for maybe 2 or 3 seconds and dies. Every single time. Doesn't matter if the engine's cold or warm, doesn't matter what time of day it is. Same thing every time." Maya nodded, processing this information. An engine that started and then immediately died could be caused by several different problems, but the fact that it was consistent suggested something specific was going on. "You said you guys checked the fuel pressure?" she asked. "First thing we did," Tony replied. "Fuel pump's working fine, pressure's exactly where it should be. We even dropped the tank and looked at the fuel pump assembly, thinking maybe there was some kind of blockage. Nothing." Maya walked to the front of the car and looked down at the engine. It was a standard 4-cylinder Honda engine, the kind she'd worked on before. Nothing too complicated or unusual about it. "What about the spark plugs?" "Brand new," Tony said. "We pulled them all out, gapped them properly, put them back in. Even tried a different set just to be sure. Sparks good and strong on all 4 cylinders." Maya was starting to get a clearer picture of what Frank and his guys had already tried. They'd covered the basics: fuel, spark, air. But there were other things that could cause this kind of problem, things that weren't always obvious. "Okay," Maya said, taking a deep breath. "I'm ready to start." Tony grinned and looked at his watch. "It's 2:15 right now, so you've got until 3:15. I'll go tell Frank the clock is running." As Tony walked back toward the garage, Maya was left alone with the Honda. She stood there for a moment, looking at the engine and trying to clear her mind. Her grandfather had taught her that the key to good diagnostics was staying calm and thinking logically. Don't jump to conclusions, don't let frustration cloud your judgment, and always start with the simplest explanation first. Maya pulled out her phone and started a timer for 1 hour. Then she walked over to the driver's side and got behind the wheel. If she was going to figure out what was wrong with this car, she needed to experience the problem herself. She turned the key, and immediately the engine cranked to life. It sounded perfect, smooth, strong, no weird noises or vibrations. But then, just as Tony had said, it died after about 3 seconds. Maya tried it again with the same result. And again, always the same thing. She popped the hood and got out, to look at the engine while it was running. On her 4th attempt to start it, she paid careful attention to what happened in those few seconds before it died. The engine sounded normal, but something about the way it shut off didn't seem right. It wasn't like it was running out of fuel or losing spark. It was more like something was telling it to turn off. Maya had seen this kind of problem before, in her grandfather's garage. There was a car that had come in with similar symptoms, and it had taken them most of a Saturday to figure out what was going on. She walked around to the passenger side and opened the door, then popped open the glove compartment. Inside, she found the owner's manual and started flipping through it, looking for the section on the security system. Honda had started putting more sophisticated anti-theft systems in their cars, and sometimes these systems could cause problems that looked like engine issues. But after checking the manual and looking at the dashboard, Maya didn't see any signs that the security system was the culprit. No warning lights, no indication that the car thought someone was trying to steal it. She moved on to her next theory. Maya walked back to the engine bay and started looking more carefully at the wiring. Tony had said they'd checked the fuel system and the ignition system, but she wondered if they'd looked at the sensors that told the engine's computer what was going on. Modern cars were full of sensors, little electronic devices that monitored everything from the temperature of the engine coolant to the amount of oxygen in the exhaust. If one of these sensors was giving bad information to the computer, it could cause the engine to shut down even when everything else was working perfectly. Maya started tracing wiring harnesses, looking for anything that seemed out of place. She checked the connections to the mass airflow sensor, the throttle position sensor, and the oxygen sensors. Everything looked clean and properly connected. But then she noticed something interesting. There was a connector near the back of the engine that looked like it had been recently disconnected and reconnected. The plastic housing was slightly dirty, but the metal pins inside were clean and shiny, like someone had been working on it recently. Maya pulled out her phone and used its flashlight to get a better look at the connector. It was attached to a sensor she recognized, the camshaft position sensor. This sensor told the engine's computer exactly where the camshaft was in its rotation, which was crucial information for timing the fuel injection and ignition. She carefully disconnected the connector and examined it more closely. At first glance, it looked fine. But when she looked at the metal pins with her phone's light, she could see something that Tony and Rick had probably missed. There was a thin layer of corrosion on two of the pins, just enough to interfere with the electrical connection. Maya felt a surge of excitement. This could be it. If the camshaft position sensor wasn't sending a clean signal to the computer, the engine would start normally, but then shut down when the computer realized it wasn't getting the information it needed. She looked around the back lot until she found a wire brush hanging on a small tool cart. She carefully cleaned the corroded pins until they were bright and shiny, then applied a small amount of dielectric grease from a tube she found in the same tool cart. After reconnecting the sensor, Maya walked back to the driver's seat. Her phone timer showed she still had 25 minutes left, but she was feeling confident about her diagnosis. She turned the key, and the Honda started immediately. But this time, instead of dying after 3 seconds, it kept running. Maya let it idle for a full minute, then revved the engine a few times. It responded perfectly, smooth and strong. She couldn't help but smile as she turned off the engine and got out of the car. Frank and his guys had been so focused on the big, obvious things, fuel pumps and spark plugs and major components, that they'd missed a simple case of connector corrosion. Just then, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Tony walking back from the garage, probably coming to check on her progress. "Find anything interesting?" he called out, but his tone suggested he was expecting to find her looking frustrated and defeated. Instead, Maya held up the car keys and pressed the remote start button. The Honda fired up immediately and settled into a smooth, steady idle. Tony stopped walking and stared at the running car like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Tony stood frozen in the back lot, staring at the Honda Civic as it purred smoothly in the afternoon air. His mouth was hanging open slightly, and Maya could see him trying to process what he was looking at. The car that had been giving him and Rick headaches for 3 solid days was now running like it had just rolled off the assembly line. "What did you—" Tony started to say, then stopped and shook his head. "How did you get it to stay running?" Maya turned off the engine and walked over to him, trying to keep the satisfaction out of her voice. She didn't want to sound smug or rub it in, even though part of her really wanted to after the way these guys had treated her. "Corroded connector on the camshaft position sensor," she said simply. The pins were dirty enough to interrupt the signal to the engine computer. Tony's face went through several different expressions in quick succession. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like embarrassment. He walked over to the engine bay and looked down at the sensor Maya had cleaned. "But we checked all the sensors," he said, more to himself than to her. "We tested everything with the scan tool." The scan tool probably showed the sensor was getting power, Maya explained. "But if the connection is corroded, the return signal gets weak or inconsistent. The computer doesn't get a clean reading, so it shuts down the engine as a safety measure." Tony was quiet for a long moment, studying the connector that Maya had cleaned. She could see him thinking back over the last 3 days, probably wondering how he and Rick had missed something so simple. "I need to get Frank," Tony said finally. "He's not going to believe this." Tony jogged back toward the garage, leaving Maya alone with the Honda again. She started it one more time just to make sure, and it fired up immediately. She let it run for a few minutes, listening to the smooth idle and feeling pretty proud of herself. Her grandfather had always told her that the best diagnostic work often involved finding the smallest problems that caused the biggest headaches. A few minutes later, she heard voices approaching from the garage. Tony was coming back, and he had Frank and Rick with him. All 3 men looked serious, like they were walking to a funeral instead of checking on a car repair. Frank approached the Honda slowly, like he was expecting it to explode or disappear in a puff of smoke. The engine was still running smoothly, and Maya could see his expression changing as he got closer. "Turn it off and start it again," Frank said, his voice much quieter than it had been earlier. Maya turned the key to shut off. The engine waited a moment, then started it again. The Honda fired up immediately and settled into that same steady idle. Frank stared at it for what felt like a full minute without saying anything. "How?" Rick asked, and Maya was surprised by how different his voice sounded now. Earlier he'd been laughing and making jokes about her. Now he just sounded confused and maybe a little embarrassed. Maya walked them over to the engine bay and showed them the connector she'd cleaned. She explained what she'd found and how she'd figured out that the corrosion was causing intermittent signal loss. "But that's such a small thing," Frank said, examining the connector closely. "How did you know to look there?" Maya felt her chest swell with confidence. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The chance to show these guys that she really did know what she was talking about. "My grandfather taught me to always start with the simple stuff before you move on to the complicated repairs," she said. "He always said that 90% of car problems have simple solutions, but people miss them because they're looking for something dramatic." Frank looked up from the engine bay, and Maya saw something change in his expression. The smugness was completely gone now, replaced by what looked like genuine curiosity. "Your grandfather?" Frank asked. "Is he a mechanic?" Maya nodded. "He ran his own shop for over 40 years. Taught me everything I know about cars. Every weekend since I was 12, we'd work on something together in his garage." "What's his name?" Frank asked, and there was something strange in his voice now. "Maybe I know him. The auto repair business around here is pretty small." Maya felt a little flutter of nervousness in her stomach. She wasn't sure why Frank was asking, but something about his tone made her think this was important. "Eduardo Martinez," she said. "He had a shop on Maple Street called Martinez Auto Service." The moment Maya said her grandfather's name, Frank's face went completely white. He actually took a step backward like someone had pushed him. Rick and Tony both looked at Frank with concern, clearly wondering what was wrong with their boss. "Eddie Martinez?" Frank said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Eddie Martinez is your grandfather?" Maya nodded, getting more worried by the second. Frank looked like he'd just seen a ghost, and she couldn't figure out what was happening. "You know him?" she asked. Frank sat down heavily on an overturned bucket that was sitting near the Honda, running his hands through his graying hair. Tony and Rick were both staring at him like they'd never seen him act this way before. "Know him?" Frank said, and Maya could hear something that sounded almost like pain in his voice. "Kid, Eddie Martinez saved my life." Maya felt her heart skip a beat. She'd heard her grandfather talk about his old employees over the years, but she couldn't remember him ever mentioning anyone named Frank Peterson. "He gave me my first real job when I was 18 years old," Frank continued, still staring at the ground. "I was a complete mess back then. Just got out of high school, no direction, no skills, heading nowhere fast. My dad had just died, and my mom was working 2 jobs to keep us afloat." Frank looked up at Maya, and she could see tears forming in his eyes. This was not at all what she'd expected when she walked into Peterson's auto repair that afternoon. "I walked into Eddie's shop looking for work, and I didn't know the first thing about cars. Couldn't tell a wrench from a screwdriver. But your grandfather, he saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself." Maya felt her own eyes getting watery as Frank continued his story. She'd heard her grandfather talk about the young men he'd trained over the years, how proud he was of watching them learn and grow and eventually start their own careers. Eddie didn't just teach me about engines and transmissions and electrical systems, Frank said. He taught me about responsibility, about treating people with respect, about doing honest work for honest pay. He was more than a boss to me. He was like a father. Frank stood up slowly, looking at Maya with completely different eyes than he had an hour earlier. The condescending, dismissive man who'd challenged her to fix the Honda was gone, replaced by someone who looked ashamed and regretful. "I can't believe you're Eddie's granddaughter," Frank said. "He used to talk about you all the time. Said he had a granddaughter who was going to be a better mechanic than any of us old-timers." Maya felt a warm feeling spreading through her chest. Her grandfather had talked about her to his former employees, had bragged about teaching her to work on cars. "He never mentioned you by name," Maya said softly. "But he talked about the guys he trained. He was always proud of how they turned out." Frank closed his eyes and shook his head. "I haven't talked to Eddie in almost 5 years. We had a stupid argument about something that doesn't even matter now, and I was too proud to call him and apologize." The back lot got very quiet, except for the sound of the Honda's engine still running smoothly. Maya could see that Tony and Rick were both processing what they'd just heard, probably realizing that they'd been making fun of the granddaughter of the man who'd trained their boss. "I owe you the biggest apology of my life," Frank said, looking directly at Maya. "And I owe your grandfather a phone call that I should have made years ago." Frank wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and took a deep breath. Maya could see him trying to pull himself together, but the emotional weight of the moment was clearly hitting him hard. Tony and Rick stood nearby, looking uncomfortable and uncertain, like they weren't sure what to do or say. "Maya," Frank said, his voice still shaky but getting stronger, "I need you to know that everything I said to you today, the way I treated you, it goes against everything your grandfather taught me about how to treat people." Maya felt a lump forming in her throat. She'd been angry at Frank just an hour ago, ready to prove him wrong and show him up. But seeing him like this, vulnerable and regretful, made all that anger start to melt away. "Eddie always told us that respect isn't something you earn because of your age or your gender or how long you've been doing a job," Frank continued. "He said respect is something you give to people because they're human beings who deserve it. And I forgot that lesson today." Frank extended his hand toward Maya, and she could see it was trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Not just for doubting your abilities, but for being rude and condescending and making you feel like you had to prove yourself to us." Maya looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then reached out and shook it. His grip was firm, but gentle, completely different from the aggressive way he'd been acting earlier. "Thank you," Maya said quietly. "That means a lot." Frank nodded, then turned to face Tony and Rick. "You two need to apologize as well. We all treated this young lady badly, and there's no excuse for it." Tony stepped forward first, looking genuinely embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Maya. You were right about the car and we were wrong about you. That was some impressive diagnostic work." Rick nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I'm sorry too. We should have given you a chance instead of assuming you didn't know what you were talking about." Maya accepted their apologies with grace, even though part of her was still processing how dramatically the situation had changed. An hour ago, these men had been laughing at her and treating her like a joke. Now they were apologizing and acknowledging her skills. "There's something else," Frank said, and Maya could see he was working up the courage to say something important. "Your grandfather didn't just teach me about cars. He taught me about running a business, about treating customers right, about building something you can be proud of." Frank gestured around at the garage and the back lot. "Everything I have, this whole business, it exists because Eddie Martinez took a chance on a punk kid who didn't know anything. And I've been running it for 20 years without ever properly thanking him." Maya felt her heart swelling with pride for her grandfather. She'd always known he was special. But hearing Frank talk about how much Eduardo had meant to him made her realize just how many lives her grandfather had touched over the years. "He talks about his old employees sometimes," Maya said. "He's proud of all of you. He loves hearing about how you're doing, what you've accomplished. Frank's face lit up at this. Really? He still thinks about us? All the time. He keeps newspaper clippings about local businesses, including auto shops. I think he knows more about what's happening in this town's car repair scene than most people who work in it. Frank laughed, and it was the first genuine happy sound Maya had heard from him all day. That sounds exactly like Eddie, always keeping track of everyone, always caring about how we were doing. You know what? Frank said suddenly, his whole demeanor changing as he got excited about something. I'm going to call him tonight. It's been way too long, and I owe him that conversation. Maya smiled. He'd love that. He's always home in the evenings, usually working on something in his garage. Still working on cars in retirement? Every day. He says he's too old to do the heavy stuff anymore, but he still loves tinkering with engines. Neighbors bring him their lawnmowers and small engines to fix. Frank shook his head in amazement. Some things never change. Eddie could never keep his hands off a broken engine. Tony cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the present moment. So, Maya fixed our problem car. What does that mean for her alternator? Frank's face got serious again, but in a different way this time. It means we fix her car for free, exactly like I promised, and we do it right with the best parts we have. He paused for a moment, then continued. But there's something else I want to discuss with you, Maya. Are you planning to go to college next year? Maya nodded. I'm hoping to study automotive engineering. I want to design better engines, maybe work for one of the car companies someday. That's exactly what Eddie always said you wanted to do, Frank said with a smile. He was so proud that you were going to take what he taught you and make it even better. Frank was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking about something. Then he looked directly at Maya with an expression that was both serious and hopeful. I have a proposition for you, he said. Not a challenge this time, but a real offer. How would you feel about working here part-time while you're finishing high school and maybe during college breaks? Maya felt her heart skip a beat. You want me to work here? I need someone who can think like you just did, Frank explained. Someone who doesn't just throw parts at problems but actually diagnoses what's wrong. Tony and Rick are good mechanics, but they get stuck in their routines sometimes. They need someone who can bring a fresh perspective. Tony nodded enthusiastically. After what you just did with that Honda, I'd love to learn from you. Maybe you could teach us some of those diagnostic tricks your grandfather showed you. Maya looked around at the three men who had been laughing at her just an hour earlier. Now they were offering her a job and asking to learn from her. It was almost too much to believe. The pay would be good, Frank continued. Better than what you're making at the grocery store, I'm sure. And you'd get real experience working on all kinds of cars, which would look great on college applications. Maya thought about it for a moment. The extra money would definitely help with college expenses, and the experience would be invaluable for her future career plans. There's one condition, she said finally. Frank raised his eyebrows. What's that? When customers come in here, especially young women or teenagers, they get treated with respect. No more assumptions about what people do or don't know based on how they look. Frank smiled broadly. Deal. In fact, that's going to be our new shop policy. Everyone gets treated like they matter, regardless of age or gender or anything else. In that case, Maya said, feeling a surge of excitement, I'd love to work here. Frank clapped his hands together. Excellent. Tony, get started on Maya's alternator right now. Use the best one we have in stock, and don't charge her anything for it. As Tony headed back toward the garage to work on her car, Frank turned to Maya one more time. You know, Eddie always said that the best mechanics aren't the ones who know the most about cars, but the ones who never stop learning and never stop caring about doing good work. Today you reminded me why he was such a great teacher. Maya felt tears forming in her eyes again, but this time they were happy tears. Thank you, Frank. For the apology, for the job offer, and for telling me about my grandfather. It means more than you know. Frank nodded. Thank you for reminding an old mechanic about what really matters. Your grandfather would be proud of you today, not just for fixing that car, but for handling yourself with such dignity when we were treating you poorly. As Maya watched Tony carefully installing her new alternator, she realized that this day had become about much more than just getting her car fixed. She'd proven herself, earned respect, found a job, and learned more about her grandfather's impact on the world. Most importantly, she'd helped repair something that had been broken for much longer than 3 days: the connection between Frank and the man who had shaped his life all those years ago. When Frank called her grandfather that evening, it would be the beginning of healing a relationship that had been damaged by pride and stubbornness. And Maya would always know that she'd played a part in bringing two people she cared about back together. Sometimes the most important repairs weren't the ones you made to engines, but the ones you made to human hearts.